musicien Glenn Patterson est doctorant en ethnomusicologie à l'Université mémorielle de St. John's à Terre-Neuve et Labrador. Depuis 2010, Glenn fait équipe avec les membres de la minorité anglophone du littoral gaspésien pour archiver et diffuser le patrimoine musical de ces derniers, que ces derniers se sont transmis de la fin des années 1950 au début des années 2000 au moyen d'enregistrements maison. Glenn collabore actuellement avec le réseau du patrimoine anglophone du Québec à un projet d'ethnomusicologie subventionné par le ministre du Patrimoine canadien et intitulé A Different Tune, Musical Heritage in English-speaking Quebec. À cette fin, il met en œuvre et adapte des pratiques d'archivage proactives au sein des communautés de langue minoritaires disséminées aux quatre coins du province. Glenn?
Thank you, Lorraine. Hello to all my colleagues. Thanks for having me. Tous les gens à Acfas, je l'apprécie beaucoup. I just want to say something about, express a bit of solidarity for what's going on at Laurentian University right now. In my paper, this idea of the importance of institutions in a cultural memory will come up later. And I really wish the best for the students and faculty there. I got to present a paper there in 2013 or 2014 to their folklore and ethnology department. And it was so clear that this was a site for the memory of especially Francophone communities in Northern Ontario. So I'll begin. In 1989, the French historian Pierre Nora proclaimed that, and I quote, "The indiscriminate production of archives is the acute effect of a new consciousness, the clearest expression of the terrorism of historicized memory." Historicized memory, tells us, is abstract, relational, and self-conscious. It seeks to destroy real memory, which takes its refuge in unself-conscious gestures, unspoken traditions, and the body's inherent self-knowledge. Nora describes modern society's memory as foremost archival. The less we experience real embodied memory, the more we turn to its, quote, exterior scaffolding and outward signs. Nora is part of a long line of critics of such externalizations of a collectivity's memory. I begin with Nora's indictment, not so much because I agree with him, or at least not with as much zeal, but simply to point out that many scholars from a range of disciplines have questioned to what extent archives constitute a kind of memory for a collectivity, if any at all. Clearly, archives have their detractors in the scholarship of collective memory. In this paper, I use insights from memory studies to conceptualize and evaluate a few approaches I have undertaken in so-called proactive archiving with the musical heritage of Quebec's English-speaking communities. While not entirely new, the concept of proactive archival access was formulated by audiovisual archivist Raymond Edmondson in his 2004 paper for UNESCO. He contrasts archives' traditional reactive access paradigm, where they wait for researchers to come in and request access to specific collections and items, with a more explicitly proactive approach. Here, archives continuously engage with communities to provoke access to and the use of their collections. In their work repatriating colonial-era recordings to rural Ugandans, ethnomusicologists Sylvia Naniyonga Tamasuza and Andrew Weintraub proposed that more proactive approaches move archives away from being, quote, a site for the passive storage of materials not in use, and move them towards a live and dialogic space where communities of ordinary people, field workers, researchers, archivists, educators, donors, and cultural policymakers interact. I find this vision of archives appealing, and it resonates with much of my work with the English-speaking minority of the Eastern Gaspé Peninsula and elsewhere in the province. I don't believe that Nora or many other of the often cited critiques of archives constitute the final word for what archives can be. Indeed, memory scholars Aleda and Jan Asman have proposed that productive interactions can exist between the documentary record with its hollow stand-ins and, on the other hand, the unself-conscious performed and embodied memories of expressive culture. I want to explore how memory can be produced through various aspects of a more proactive archival practice, from access to collections development, administration, and in its direct relationships with the public and its institutions. In this paper, I will draw on 11 years of experience proactively archiving in Quebec, paying particular attention to aspects of labor and visibility and proactive archival approaches. I will conclude by reflecting on some of the limits of proactive archiving in the context of Quebec's English-speaking minorities. In 2009, I was working an engineering job and hosting a bluegrass and old-time country jam at a bar on Bishop Street in downtown Montreal on Thursday nights. I was the house fiddler. There, a regular guitar player named Brian Morris mentioned one night that his father, Erskine, was an old-time fiddler from an English-speaking community on the Gaspé coast. A few months later, he emailed me several recordings that he had recently digitized of his father. I was blown away by the caliber and the uniqueness of the repertoire. While his father never spoke French, he possessed a vast repertoire of local English titled tunes, but delivered in a style with all the strongest hallmarks of French Canadian and Acadian fiddle styles. We started sharing these tunes on a blog dedicated to his father. In addition to other fiddlers passionate about regional North American fiddle styles, our blog soon began attracting positive feedback from English speakers still living in Gaspé, some of whom had known or were related to Brian's father. As well, it attracted the attention of what I call the Anglo-Gaspésian diaspora, which exists in Canada and throughout the United States. I remember on my first visit to Gaspé in 2010 with Brian Morris, we were at his Aunt Phyllis's house in Douglastown, overlooking the Bay of Gaspé and playing her some of the Gaspé tunes we'd recently learned from old tapes. We were chatting about old players and dancers when suddenly she stepped into her bedroom and returned with a binder. In that binder, there was a printout of every blog post we'd ever published with her written commentary on sticky notes attached to each page. She was keeping her own archives on our archival work. This trip to Gaspé, my first, coincided with the annual Irish Week Festival in the village of Douglastown, just outside the village of Gaspé. It was organized by the village's community center. And this community center had just begun a project to produce an ethnographic CD and booklet of local musical heritage. They hired myself and another performer at the festival, the fiddler and musicologist Laura Risk, to serve as research consultants and later producers of this CD. We returned to the festival every year between 2010 and 2014 as both researchers and performers. By 2013, Laura and I had digitized over 60 hours of home recordings from the community. And we used this digital collection to create the 74-minute CD and booklet that was released the following year at the festival in 2014. At the launch event in the parish hall, about 200 community members came out to listen to live performances, hear selections from the CD, and listen to testimony from several community members about their relationship to the music on the CD. My above described interactions with the community were thick with embodied memory. For Laura, Brian, and I, playing back their musical heritage for them, whether as performers or sharing our research archives during presentations, brought forth waves of embodied collective remembering. People got up and square danced or step danced, or they would chat to the person beside them about who the last tune was named after, or who used to play it, or dance to it, or who simply enjoyed it. Sometimes people would offer to loan us additional home recordings. These were precisely the kinds of productive interactions between this growing documentary record we were helping to produce and the embodied memory of the community's musical heritage. In 2012, 2 years after I began this project as a hobby, I was accepted into the ethnomusicology PhD program at Memorial University in St. John's, Newfoundland. By the time I was ready for my PhD fieldwork, Laura and I had already finished the Douglastown CD. And so I made the central orientation of my dissertation fieldwork the following: what should be done with the more than 60 hours of audio that had been digitized through my previous collaborations with people like Laura Risk, Brian Morris, and the Douglastown Community Center? Did the community envision a future for this collection? The first task, it seemed to me, would be to find a local institutional partner to collaborate in providing some form of local preservation, access to, and use of the recordings. Let me put my visuals up. That's the Douglastown CD. And here's Vision Gaspé Percy Now. So the local organization Vision Gaspé Percy Now serves the region's English-speaking population, particularly in the areas of access to healthcare and social services. They were quickly interested in collaborating. Importantly, they allowed me to engage in proactive archival outreach activities with the wider English-speaking population around Gaspé Bay, beyond the confines of the parish of Douglastown. I was less interested in digitizing as much as material as possible, and more interested in a co-created space of live collective memory, one that was more responsive to the present-day realities and priorities of the community. But what makes an archive is both a collection of media and a set of practices, such as space. I propose that we borrow some insights and metaphors from memory studies. And I found the British social anthropologist, Paul Connerton, inspiring in this regard. Theorizing why certain places are memorable, Connerton points to the, quote, slow world before the age of mechanical reproduction, where the term building would apply as much to the memory of the construction as to that of the eventual product. For Connerton, our experience of the time of labor and modern capitalism, where we do not know, see, or even imagine the people making the objects we use, engenders widespread cultural forgetting. As he puts it, the first thing to be forgotten is the labor itself. Archives have traditionally worked behind closed doors, obscuring the slow, careful, collaborative labor required to assemble and safeguard their collections. Through community outreach opportunities, Vision Gaspé Percy Now provided a crucial visibility for a range of archival labors, past, present, and future, that the project would not have otherwise had. Visibility manifested in a number of ways. Early on, we created a blog to share selections from the archives, update the community about our work, and notify them of upcoming outreach events. Our most successful blog post in terms of views and comments came from September 2016. It describes my long-term collaboration with an elderly gentleman from Gaspé named Leo Fitzpatrick, who wanted to donate to us 600 home recordings that he had made between 1958 and the early 2000s. Because my archival project is digital rather than a physical repository, the post also describes our work with the archives at the nearby Musée de la Gaspésie in the town of Gaspé to accession his tapes into their state-of-the-art facilities for physical preservation. At the end of the post, I shared a playlist featuring the first tape that Leo ever recorded on his reel-to-reel player in 1958. In short, the post's narrative highlights labors past, present, and future. These are Leo Fitzpatrick's labors recording and meticulously cataloging over 600 hours of home recordings of local musical heritage, the labor that we undertook to find a home for his physical tapes with the Musée de la Gaspésie and their archives, and the work we hope to do in the future to make more of his collection easily accessible. Part of Vision's core programming are their wellness centers. These events begin in the morning with games and light exercise before lunch for isolated English-speaking seniors in the area. In the afternoon, there's usually a presentation or activity led by a guest from the general public. In October 2015, they invited me to talk about our archival collaboration and share excerpts from the archives. I had prepared 7 copies as well of an archival sampler to give out for free. This to augment the 13-song playlist that I shared during the presentation. The sampler CDs were quickly snapped up, and in the following weeks, I delivered an additional 10 copies to those who weren't quick enough for the original limited supply. Connerton argues that gift exchange, quotes, potentiates memory because it rests upon a triple obligation: the obligation to give, the obligation to receive, and the obligation to reciprocate. 2 of the 10 people who I gave sampler CDs to reciprocated my gesture in the following months when we crossed paths. One woman gave me a 10-pack of blank Memorex CDRs and jewel cases for my future work with the community. I'm sure I've burned close to 100 CDRs of such archival samplers during my fieldwork. These CDRs and their envelopes and track listings make visible the social relationships embedded in the collaborative archival labor. It always feels nice to talk about what went well in our projects, but there are lessons in the failures, setbacks, and ongoing challenges. I will conclude my presentation by way of a few reflections on a few such challenges and hint at some possible questions for the discussion period and as well as future research. Succession planning is a huge challenge in rural aging communities. Because so much of my work has been project-based, an ongoing challenge has been what happens once the project is over and I need to step away. As I take on new projects to stay employed, I don't have as much time to prepare blog posts for previous projects, nor to keep digitizing more home recordings from community members. In Gaspé, it was very difficult to find local people interested in taking a more active leadership role in the maintenance and development of our archival collaboration, although they were very happy to help me whenever they could. As a community that has been experiencing a brain drain for over 50 years, it's not entirely fair to expect someone local to have the same interest and time that I once did to further this project. But these demographic and socioeconomic trends, of course, go far beyond my small project. These are trends which I believe have broader implications for the future memory of these communities and perhaps other linguistic minorities in Canada. Memory scholarship shows us that collective memory is at least in part reliant upon a certain institutionalization. Institutionalization in museums, archives, churches, veterans associations, even schools. In Gaspé, in the English-speaking community, there was always talk that one of the local legions might be forced to shut down next year due to dwindling finances, or that a small English public school or the English section of the Cégep in Gaspé will close if enrollment keeps dropping. Anglophone participation in state institutions of memory, like the Musée de la Gaspésie, can be complicated due to language barriers for some of the older community members especially. And then there's the perennial question of comfort for English speakers in institutions of the Quebec state. I don't have time to explore these here, but you can ask me about them in the question period. On the other hand, Gaspé is a place that is at once thick with memory for the aging English-speaking community there. It's a place where people still refer to a piece of land by the person who owned it 50 years ago or more. But on the other hand, the institutions that help support this memory are increasingly fragile. For my part, I'm comforted somehow for now, just knowing that there exists multiple hard drives securing 3 copies of the archival collections in different locations, that there is a nominal online presence for this musical heritage, and that a few more people, both Francophone and Anglophone, are playing this music in the area and beyond. And moreover, that there is a future embodied and externalized for this musical heritage. Thank you.
Qu'est-ce que ça donne à une communauté en situation minoritaire de participer dans les activités de patrimoine et d'archivistique sur le plan vitalité? C'est-à-dire comment si je comprends le message de vos 2 présentations, il y a une double fonction. Il y a la préservation de la mémoire, il y a aussi l'activité de consolider la mémoire qui semble être une activité de développement communautaire, mais j'aimerais avoir vos pensées là-dessus.
I would say for rural English speakers, I'll take the case of Gaspé. They don't get to see themselves very much in local media. They were once much more involved, but as the community has declined, their ability to participate in things like Radio Gaspésie, where there used to be, a significant amount of English programming, no longer exist. They're almost absent from Télé Gaspé. There's often initiatives to try to bridge that gap, but I feel like making this available, letting them participate in them, it gives it's a symbolic value. It's a space where their culture and heritage is reflected, and that's quite rare. Despite the fact that everyone there thinks about heritage, a lot of people are amateur historians. you know, there's no grand projects to reflect that heritage. So I think that's important to people from a symbolic level. And I think it's both symbolic and practical, in fact. I think one of the hopes of this kind of archival work that I do is that, you know, you're gonna provide access to these older traditions, and all of a sudden the younger community members are going to take up the fiddle and they're going to learn to step dance and all these aspirations. In fact, you know, it's difficult with English speaking community. Musical tastes have changed in the last 50 years. Country music, I love country music, but it's much easier to learn 4 chords on a guitar and sing country songs and sing thousands of country songs than it is to learn an old archaic fiddle repertoire that people haven't really played in the area for 30, 40 years. So this, to actually become a practitioner of this, a lot of the culture that I represent it's difficult. But there is an appreciation because these people are related to the people on the recording. So I want to point out though, on that theme, a lot of the impact of our archival recordings in terms of people embodying the music, learning the music, has been in the Francophone community. The trad community, like you know, Le Vent du Nord, Chanticorum, a lot of these big stars have found our blog and they've learned tunes. And I find on most of the CDs released in the last 10 years, there's 1 or 2 tracks from Mr. Erskine Morris, who I have put up there in the corner, which is pretty touching. I remember being at the festival in 2012 or 13. There was a great step dancer and pedagogue there, Jean-François Berthiaume. He didn't, you know, he arrived in this village hired to teach dance at the Irish Week, but he didn't even know there were Anglophones in the Gaspé Coast. And an older gentleman came into his class one day and showed him a dance that he'd never seen before. And he was just amazed that, you know, all of a sudden he saw Anglophones in the Gaspésie as part of his idea of what constituted Québécois. Like they were all of a sudden Québécois. We were all Québécois. It was very touching to see. More recently in the region, a couple have moved there, Guy Bouchard and Laura Sadowski. They originally had a record label and they lived north of Quebec City. They were just big promoters of Québécois traditional music in Quebec and beyond. They retired to Douglastown and they're both great musicians, and they've started hosting regular dances where they insist on playing the music from these archives. You know, they don't play generic stuff at all. You know, they're very hardcore, and they've gotten the older English community to teach the traditional dances, and the younger Francophone community who've moved there in the last 20 years from places like Montreal, Sherbrooke, Quebec City, have been mostly providing the dance, you know, so, and the music as well. But yeah, there's this relationship between the Francophone and Anglophone communities there, which is very touching. So actually, I think as much as I think this documentary memory in its current form speaks to mostly an English-speaking heritage, who's helping preserve that memory these days, at least in its most embodied senses, are local Francophones.